Thank you very much, Marty, and good morning, everyone. And I just want to second some of the comments that have already been made this morning about the quality of the workshop. I was greatly honored last year to be asked by Cisco to help to convene the faculty for the workshop and develop the curriculum. And I think we had a wonderful course last year. I think it's already improved this year with really wonderful presentations by the speakers so far, and most importantly, wonderful participation from you in the audience. The quality of the workshop depends on you and your participation, and your very thoughtful questions yesterday provoked a lot of discussion, and I think we'll continue, I'm sure, throughout the remainder of the workshop. So I'm going to talk this morning in this talk about the primary responsibilities that you have if you are the principal investigator for a clinical trial. If there's one thing that you remember from this lecture, it's the first three words on the slide. You're in charge. So just keep that in mind as I go through. So what do we mean by clinical research broadly speaking? Well, the NIH in the U.S. includes these types of activities in the definition of clinical research. Epidemiological and behavioral studies, those are usually observational studies, outcomes research and health services research, and then patient-oriented research, which is research conducted with human subjects, with tissues from human subjects, biospecimens, or cognitive phenomena for which an investigator directly interacts with a human subject. And that's mostly what we think about in the cancer community as doing cancer clinical trials. There are also healthy volunteer studies, which include individuals who have no significant health problem, but who volunteer to participate in clinical research, usually to test a drug, a device, or some other sort of intervention. We don't generally do healthy volunteer studies in the cancer community, but they're commonly done in many other therapeutic areas, usually with drugs that have a more favorable safety profile than many of the cancer drugs do, where it's a bit safer to expose a healthy individual to a low dose of a drug. So clinical trials, which is a subset of patient-oriented research, really are prospective studies involving human subjects that are designed to answer specific questions about the effects or impact of particular biomedical or behavioral interventions. So clinical trials generally are not healthy volunteer studies, which are designed to develop new knowledge, but are not intended to provide any direct health benefits to the participants because, of course, they're already healthy. Now, we also talk a lot these days about translational research, and there are many definitions of translational research, and this is one definition that's been developed also by the NIH, which is that translational research is the process of applying discoveries generated during research in the laboratory and in preclinical studies to the development of trials and studies in humans. That's one aspect of translational research, often referred to in the U.S. as T1 translation, so laboratory to the clinic. Another aspect of translational research is leveraging observations made in clinical practice to drive new mechanistic interventions at the bench. So, an example of that might be you make an observation that some patients who receive treatment with a particular drug have much worse toxicity than the average patient, and you wonder why that might be. And then you conceive of studies whereby you might study that drug more intensively in the laboratory, or might study the genetic material from the patients to better understand why it is that some people have much more severe toxicity. That's a clinic to laboratory translation. And then the other kind of translational research is really enhancing the adoption of best practices in the community. This is often referred to in the U.S. as T2 research, meaning going from the clinic to the population, to be sure that what we think works based upon clinical trials actually does work when it's applied in the community practice of medicine. So this slide just sort of illustrates these same points, showing that these types of basic clinical and translational research really are very interdependent and really represent transfer of knowledge from the laboratory to the clinic to the population and back again, so that we can use observations made in people to advance hypotheses that we can then test in the laboratory. Now, most of drug development and most clinical trials follow a general set of operating standards that have been referred to as good clinical practice, or GCP. GCP is an ethical and scientific standard that describes the design, conduct, performance, monitoring, auditing, analysis, and reporting of trials that involve participation of human subjects. So it is a set of standard operating procedures about how to do studies in human beings with the goal of ensuring that there is public confidence that the rights, safety, and well-being of the trial subjects are protected, and that the clinical trial data are accurate, credible, and reliable. Because most pharmaceutical companies that develop drugs develop them all across the world, because all people have the same health problems and need the same types of beneficial medicines, there's been an effort made now for some time to harmonize the GCP requirements in multiple regulatory jurisdictions in the world. And that's a process known as the International Conference on Harmonization of GCP that began in 1996. And it has developed a set of unified standards across the GCPs of the US, Japan, the European Union, Canada, Australia, Scandinavia, and the World Health Organization. And it really enables universal recognition of clinical data when these harmonized guidelines are followed, so that presumably the same standards can be applied to developing drugs in the US, in Japan, in Europe, etc. Lillian showed yesterday a slide similar to this one describing how to do phase 1 clinical trials, and of course the same applies in doing all kinds of clinical trials. None of us can do a well-conducted clinical trial on our own. We need lots of help from lots of well-qualified and well-trained people, and it's up to us as the principal investigator for the trial to develop the team that is necessary to complete the trial well. So the team includes all of the people shown on this slide, and probably others not shown, but research nurses, data coordinators, laboratory staff, pharmacists, biostatisticians, of course, radiologists, and all sorts of other types of investigators, depending upon what the research objectives of the study might be. The activities of all of these individuals must be defined by the principal investigator and must be monitored by the principal investigator to ensure that all members of the team are working well together. So what does it mean to be the PI of a study? Fundamentally, the PI is responsible for the overall conduct of the study. So that will include developing the research protocol, of course, interactions with appropriate regulatory agencies, developing the financial and regulatory aspects of contracts or grants that are necessary to support the study, making any modifications to the original study protocol, correspondence with the Institutional Review Board or Ethics Committee, or other regulatory correspondence, and as I said, assembling and overseeing the team that's running the trial. A principal investigator, and indeed all of the even co-investigators on a study, need to be qualified to be a principal investigator by virtue of their education, their training, their experience to assume the proper conduct of the trial. They need to be aware of and be willing to comply with the GCP standards. They should be familiar with the use of the investigational product or device that's being studied. And, of course, they should be interested in the scientific aspects of the trial. Presumably, if they weren't interested, they wouldn't be starting the trial to begin with. Importantly, the PI has to have time available. They have to have time to discuss and read and approve the study protocol. They have to have time to identify and recruit suitable subjects to participate in the research study and to properly assess and follow those subjects. It's very difficult to function effectively as a PI in the middle of a very busy clinical practice. Most of us have to do that because we care for patients and we make an effort to care for patients and also have them participate in clinical trials. But having the time available to think about the research study, think about what's happening in the patients, make the observations in the patients and the appropriate documentation of their outcomes is very important. The PI has to have adequate personnel and resources to conduct the trial. You have to be able to meet recruitment targets and should not have competing trials. This is both a practical, a financial, and even an ethical obligation. Yesterday, Professor Johnston talked about ethical considerations in clinical trials. A clinical trial that begins to enroll patients but never is completed and never achieves its research objectives does a disservice to the patients who've been already willing to volunteer to participate in the study. So it's very important when starting off, when assessing the goals of the clinical trial, to make certain that you have an adequate patient population available to actually complete the accrual requirements of the protocol. And of course, the research study should be conducted in compliance with the protocol and without deviation. Again, we heard yesterday about examples where protocol deviations cause lots of problems. There are always imbalances between the patient population and the requirements of the protocol. And the appropriate action to take in such circumstances, if you think it's medically and scientifically appropriate, is to modify the protocol, not to violate the protocol by enrolling people who are not eligible for it, but instead to write an amendment to the protocol that changes the protocol in an official way to accommodate patients who you think probably should be included, but perhaps were excluded for some technical reason when the protocol was first written. The principal investigator has to maintain a list of the research team members to whom trial-related responsibilities have been delegated. So you have to be able to say right from the beginning which member of the team is responsible for what activities that are required by the protocol. You have to keep the research team members informed at all times about how the trial is going. Is the accrual going all right? Are there any unexpected or unexpectedly severe toxicities that are being observed, or other technical problems with the protocol that your team needs to know about? And from time to time, protocols are monitored or audited by the sponsor of the study or by a regulatory agency, and you have to comply with those requests for such monitoring. Now, this is probably the most important slide in this presentation. As the PI, you certainly may delegate responsibilities to trained and qualified members of the research team, but the PI retains the ultimate responsibility for the overall conduct of the study. So if one of your team members makes a mistake that somehow compromises the integrity of the study, that is your responsibility. And a big part of your responsibility is to ensure that your team members are well trained in their responsibilities on the requirements of the study. So you should keep a list of all the team members, all the study personnel. You should have their initials and signatures on file. You should have their resumes, their CVs, their qualifications and responsibilities. You should be able to document their dates of participation in the study. All of this goes typically into a folder or a book, or now it can, of course, go into a PDF file on a computer that constitutes the regulatory binder for the study. You should have up-to-date, signed and dated CVs for the staff who are involved in consenting and assessing the research subjects in the study, and any individuals who make entries in the case report forms, and for any of the laboratories that are providing laboratory results for the participants in the study. You should have up-to-date licenses of those laboratories to be sure that they're appropriately certified and qualified to do the laboratory studies that are required, and you should have a record of what is the normal range of each of the laboratory values that they report out. Now, we heard a lot of discussion already yesterday about IRB, so I'll go through this part pretty quickly. An IRB is a number of individuals who collectively have the qualifications and experience to review and evaluate the science, the medical aspects, and the ethics of the proposed trial. Generally speaking, IRB should have at least 5 individuals. The size, of course, may vary depending upon the volume of activity they have to deal with. At least one member of the IRB should be someone who is a member of the general public, not a scientist, not a physician, someone who sort of represents the patients who are going to be participating in the study. At least one member of the IRB should be completely independent of the study site. And only members of the IRB who are independent of the investigator and the sponsor can provide opinions or vote at an IRB meeting. Because again, the primary purpose of the IRB is to protect the interests of the participants in the study. Before beginning a clinical trial, of course, you have to seek approval from the IRB or the ethics committee for all of the relevant documents that describe the study. That includes the trial protocol, the investigator brochure, any amendments to the protocol document, the written informed consent form. Any other written information that will be provided to a study participant has to be IRB approved. So if you were going to write a little pamphlet or brochure to try to advertise the study, to recruit subjects for it, the information in that pamphlet has to first be approved by the IRB before it can be distributed to any potential study participants. And any other type of subject recruitment material, such as video or any other materials that a subject might see. Now, of course, you have to keep records when doing the protocol. Those are usually in the form of a case report form. Nowadays, more and more of those are electronic, more so than written. But the purpose of the case report form is to record the protocol required information on each trial subject. Keep in mind that the case report form is different from a source document. A source document is the actual medical documentation that is developed in the process of caring for the patient who's participating in the clinical trial. So the source document may be a hospital record, a clinical note, laboratory studies, a pathology report, an X-ray report, and so on. The source documents provide the information that is then abstracted and recorded in the case report form and becomes part of the official database for the study. But when a study is audited, the case report forms will be audited against the source documents to be sure that the information in the case report forms is accurate. And as the PI, you have to assume responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, and timeliness of the data reported in the case report forms. And the data in the case report forms must be consistent and has to be able to be verifiable with the source documents. There are lots of little technical things about how to make corrections to case report forms. Periodically mistakes are made. And when a mistake is made in a case report form, it should be corrected in a way that is very transparent, so people who are reviewing it can see what the error was and what the correction was and when the correction was made and by whom. So here's just an example. If I was recording the city Shanghai in a case report form and misspelled it, and I had to correct it, I would cross out, not erase, but cross out what was the mistake. I would replace it with the correct spelling. I would initial it with my initials and put the date on when I made the correction. So that way it's fully auditable and everyone can see what changes were made, when and by whom. If there's new information that becomes available about the study while the study is ongoing, that information must be provided to the IRB. And in fact, not even just information about the study, but information that might affect the conduct of the study. So, for example, you might get information from a different study about the same drug that's in your study that suggests that there's a safety signal that the participants in your study should be aware of. If you get information like that, you have to report it to your IRB. It may require that you make modifications to the protocol or the consent form. It might require that the participants in your study be re-consented and provided the additional safety information, and even be given an opportunity at that point to withdraw from participating in the study if they felt that the new information somehow jeopardizes their safety. When you provide that information and how you provide it to the patients should be done in consultation with the IRB. If it's something that is potentially very serious, very damaging to patients, generally speaking, you can provide that immediately to patients because it may affect their health and well-being, even before you have official IRB approval to do so. But for most new information that comes in a study, first you should get the approval of the IRB, and then you should provide the information to the patients. As I said, patients can be informed of the new information at their next visit to the doctor unless there is considerable risk to the subject or their consent is likely to be revoked, in which case you really should present the information to them as soon as you receive it. An updated consent form can be signed once approved by the IRB, and a note should be made in the patient's medical record that the new information had been given to the subject. And it may be necessary when new information is developing during the course of a research study to stop the recruitment of new patients until the IRB has had an opportunity to fully review the new information and recommend any modifications to the protocol or the consent form before the subject recruitment resumes again. Now, a lot of what we do in clinical research and a lot of the responsibility of the PI is safety reporting. If you ask me, what is the major responsibility of the principal investigator of a study, it is not, to test a new drug. It is not to develop new information. The major responsibility of the PI is to keep the participants in the study safe. That is really the primary responsibility. So one way of doing that, of course, is to monitor and record and report adverse events that happen to the participants in the study. So the term adverse event is a very broad term and really refers to anything bad that happens to a subject in a clinical trial. It does not necessarily have a causal relationship with the treatment. And of course, in the cancer patient population, because they're sick and they have very complicated illnesses, many adverse events happen. One of the responsibilities of the PI is to try to figure out what is the likely relationship between the observed adverse event and the intervention that's actually being studied in the clinical trial. Now, the term serious adverse event has a more formal regulatory definition in most parts of the world. And a serious adverse event typically refers to any medical occurrence that falls in one of the categories shown on this slide. So anything that results in death, is life-threatening to a patient, requires hospitalization of a patient or prolongs the hospitalization of a patient, results in significant or persistent disability, results in birth defects, or is a medically significant problem like the development of a second malignancy, for example. All of those would be considered to be serious adverse events and have to be reported as such. When you're evaluating an adverse event, one of the major roles that the principal investigator has is to determine what's known as the attribution. That is the event expected or unexpected, and what is its likely relationship to the study drug or to the intervention that's being tested. So how would you know if something is unexpected? Well, if it's not been reported anywhere, if it's not listed as a potential side effect in the investigator brochure, in the protocol, in the consent form, or anywhere in the medical literature, you could consider to be unexpected. Sometimes an unexpected event may be an increase in the frequency or severity of things that may commonly occur in the patient population. So one of the things that we have to deal with very frequently in the cancer patient population is the fact that we're dealing with older individuals who have many other medical problems. And some of the serious adverse events that are most difficult for us to detect would be an increase in the risk of a medical problem that occurs fairly commonly already in that patient population. So an increase in the incidence or severity of hypertension or stroke or vascular thrombosis. Those are all things that are very difficult to detect as being related to a drug because they're fairly common in the older patient population that has cancer to begin with. As I mentioned, it's very important to determine if the event is study drug related. So how would you determine that? Well, you have to understand the mechanism of action of the drug, prior experience with that drug or with related drugs. From what you know about the drug pharmacology, is it likely to be able to cause the observed adverse event? Does the adverse event stop when the drug administration is discontinued? Does it recur when the drug is re-administered? So these are all ways of trying to determine the attribution or the causal relationship between the study drug and the adverse event. And if an association cannot be conclusively ruled out, then you have to report the adverse event as being at least possibly related to the study drug. Now, I've been talking up until now about the responsibilities of the principal investigator of the study. And for most studies that are done, there is another entity which is considered to be the sponsor of the study. Oftentimes that's a pharmaceutical company. Sometimes it can be a not-for-profit agency. In the U.S., the National Cancer Institute is oftentimes the sponsor of studies. Sometimes the investigator can also be the sponsor. And when the investigator is also the sponsor, then the principal investigator has additional responsibilities. They have to meet the same responsibilities that the sponsor does, and that's what's listed on this slide and the next. So the sponsor is responsible for implementing and maintaining quality assurance for the trial in compliance with the protocol, GCP, and regulatory requirements. It's the sponsor who develops the investigational plan, that is, writes the protocol. It's the sponsor who typically manufactures and labels the investigational products that are being studied. The sponsor has to obtain regulatory approval before the study begins. And it's up to the sponsor to initiate the accrual, terminate the accrual, and so on based upon the overall conduct of the study. And, of course, the sponsor, particularly if it's a pharmaceutical company, cannot commercialize the product until they receive approval from the regulatory authorities in their jurisdiction to do so. The sponsor has to select qualified investigators, train them, disseminate information to them about the research, select individuals to monitor the study while it's ongoing. The sponsor has to receive and evaluate all the adverse events observed in the study from all of the participating sites, and if necessary, to make revisions to the protocol based upon those adverse events. And ultimately, of course, the sponsor's goal is to seek marketing approval for the drug if the protocol endpoints are met and if the drug can be shown to be safe and effective in the proposed indication. Now, a very important aspect of conducting any clinical trial is assuring the quality of the study, compliance with the protocol, and the accuracy and reliability of the data that are assembled in the protocol. So there are several ways in which that can be accomplished. One is monitoring the study. Monitoring the study is the act of overseeing the progress of a clinical trial and of ensuring that it is conducted, recorded, and reported in accordance with the protocol, with GCP, and with applicable regulatory requirements. Monitoring tends to be a fairly real-time evaluation of how the study is going. So any of you who have ever participated in a pharmaceutical company-sponsored study, you probably have frequently, every few months, had a monitor show up at your institution to evaluate the records and make sure that the study is being conducted properly. Auditing tends to be more retrospective. It tends to occur after the completion of the study. It's a systematic and independent examination of trial-related activities and documents to determine whether or not the protocol has been conducted in the appropriate way. Now, oftentimes what shows up in an audit is referred to as a deviation. And in the U.S. system, at least, as organized by the NCI, we consider two categories of deviations, so-called major deviations and minor deviations. A major deviation is a variation in the protocol that makes the resulting data questionable. So factors that have a significant impact on the treatment or reporting of toxicity, for example. Minor deviations generally do not affect the outcome or interpretation of the study and are less severe than major deviations. So what might be examples of major deviations? Well, if the consent form is signed by the patient after they begin treatment, that's a major deviation. If treatment that's not specified by the protocol is administered, so some additional treatment is used that's not specified by the, might be medically justified, but it would be a protocol deviation if it happened. And generally speaking, if it becomes necessary to administer non-protocol specified therapy, then the patient has to be removed from participation in the study. Commercial drug substituted for investigational drug. This is actually a very common problem because sometimes the drug that's being investigated is already commercially available for another purpose. And oftentimes what will happen is that the sponsor provides the investigational drug for the study, which may be identical to the commercial drug that your pharmacy also has available, although it will be labeled differently. It will be labeled for investigational use. If for some reason you run out of the investigational drug, you cannot just substitute the commercial drug. That would be viewed as just the same as if it was substituting one drug for another, even though it's the same pharmaceutical product. And then failure to report toxicities that would require filing of an SAE would be another major deviation. This is just some data, a couple of years old now, about the experience of the NCI cooperative groups in the U.S. and their audit programs. So it shows data over about a 5-year period from 2005 through 2010 of almost 7,000 audits that were conducted of about 48,000 patients. And the types of major deficiencies that were revealed in those audits. You can see that the most common area of deficiency is said to be IRB. That doesn't mean that there was a problem with the IRB. What that means is that the site, the investigator, was delayed in submitting materials to the IRB that the IRB was required to review. All of the other areas of major deviation are relatively of similar magnitude distributed across all these different areas. So problems with obtaining informed consent, eligibility problems, about 5% of the major deviations were in patients failing to meet eligibility requirements. 7% of the time, major deviations in the way the treatment was given, and so on. So this just gives you a general idea of the kinds of problems that show up in these audits. You can see that the frequency is relatively low, so that's a good thing. But there are still problems that we need to improve upon. Now, with respect to data analysis and reporting, again, very important to keep in mind. As the PI, you must have access to all of the study data. This is particularly true when you're dealing with a pharmaceutical company sponsor, because oftentimes the sponsor maintains the database for the study, but you have to get agreement right from the start that you will have access to all of the study data, you will have control over how the data are analyzed and interpreted, and you will have the right to publish the data. And if you don't get those agreements from the sponsor, my own opinion would be you should not be participating in that study. Sponsors will have the right to review a manuscript that you might be writing about the results of the study, but all they can do is review and comment. They can't really change anything, and they can't provide any impediment to getting the study published in a reasonable time period. So if you look at how do you judge whether you're doing a good job or a poor job with data analysis and reporting, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but basically a good quality publication will specify the entry criteria and selection process used to identify patients to participate in the study, will precisely list any protocol violations that occurred, will have well-defined criteria of treatment response, will do a statistical analysis known as analysis by intention to treat, will provide a comprehensive description of the toxicities observed in the study. And we've seen many examples already where studies have been reported with the selective omission of certain key toxicities. At the time of the initial study report, it was only after the drug, in some cases, was marketed and there was more widespread experience that some of the toxicities became more evident. And so we have to be very careful about that. We had a little bit of discussion yesterday about conflict of interest, so I'll go through this very quickly. This really relates to financial conflicts of interest. So it's important that there be disclosure of financial or other interest that might be construed as resulting in an actual, potential, or apparent conflict. And the purpose of this disclosure is to maintain the confidence of the general population, the scientific community, and the regulatory authorities in the quality and integrity of the data. Different institutions have their own conflict of interest definitions. ASCO has a policy that requires disclosure of any employment or leadership position with a pharmaceutical company sponsor, whether you have an advisory role with a company, whether you own stock in the company that's sponsoring the study, whether you receive honoraria from consulting with the company, whether you receive research grants from the company, etc. Examples of activities that are prohibited by ASCO's conflict of interest policy: finder fees. This came up in a question yesterday. You can't receive money from the company in order to identify patients to go on the study. Bonuses for achieving certain levels of accrual. That would be considered to be unethical. Payments that are contingent upon achieving certain outcomes. You don't want to be accused of being bribed in order to show that the study has a positive outcome, and so on. So this is my final slide. The critical thing to remember when you're the principal investigator on a clinical trial is that you're in charge. Running a clinical trial is a complicated business. You will need the full support from your research team. You'll need to be careful and stringent on every trial-related issue. You'll need to protect the rights and integrity of your trial subjects. As I said, that is probably the most important responsibility of the PI. And enjoy it. Doing clinical trials can be great fun, can be very stimulating, and can have huge impact for patients. And that's what we're here for. So thank you very much. So we may have time for a question or two.
So now we are open to question and answer. Yeah, please.
I have two questions. The first question is about the publication. So in your slide, you mentioned that the PI has a full right to write the publication and have for the result and the conclusion. But I'm concerned if pharmaceutical company who funding the study, you have the right to give comments and the PI accept the comments. That is the first question. The second question, maybe I want to ask our Chinese KOLs. Because for the authorship of the publication, so always we said we should specify the rules of the authorship in the publication. But how do we think about that in our real world?
Yeah. So two excellent questions. So, generally speaking, when you are agreeing with a pharmaceutical company to be the PI of a study, you have a contract. And the contract should specify very early on that you as the PI will have the rights to receive the entire database for the study, to review it, to analyze it, and to publish it. And if the company is unwilling to grant you that right in the contract, you should really think twice about whether you want to be working with that company. Now, even with that, sometimes it's very difficult because, as you point out, the company usually controls the database, and you don't always know exactly what you're getting when they give you the data to look at. So there has to be some element of trust. You have to go through the data very carefully. If you see things that are inconsistent or don't make sense, you should request, if there's additional data, to be available. Generally speaking, the most sort of principles of research would give you, as the PI, the authority to publish the data freely and without bias and so on. The company, though, as the sponsor, should have an opportunity to review your draft manuscript before it goes in for publication, because they have a stake in the research too. And you want to be sure that they have a chance to comment on it, but not necessarily to unduly influence the way the research is being reported. With respect to authorship, again, I think this is sometimes very complicated because, particularly with multi-center studies, there are many people who participate in the study. There may be many people involved in developing the study, people enrolling patients on the study. For multi-center studies, it's oftentimes a good idea to have an arrangement specified in advance as to either who the authors will be. Sometimes a writing committee is specified in the protocol or the contract that says who's going to actually write the manuscript. Sometimes there are rules that are made. So, for example, if your institution enrolls 10% or more of the patients in the trial, then you can specify an individual as a co-author on the study. But the more that you can reach agreement on right at the beginning, before you know anything about the outcome of the study, then the better.
So for the second question, I think the Chinese code leader also similar criteria based on the international. So we are dependent on the contribution of the trials, such as how many patients do you involve in, and how to deep involving in the manuscript. I thought the same extent. Yeah. Please, another question. So I have the one question. So for the phase 2 trials, the most clinical trial initiated by the industrial company. So how to balance the PI and the company? I think this is sometimes very difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a very important question. Now, in my experience, most companies that are serious about doing cancer drug development want to work very effectively and collaboratively with the PI. It's in the company's best interest, and it's in the PI's best interest for there to be a strong working relationship. Sometimes you have often a small company, an inexperienced company, a company that maybe only has one product in development, where the entire financial future of the company depends on the performance of that product. And sometimes they try to be much more influential in how the study is designed or conducted or reported. And I think, again, as the PI, you have to guard against that. It's difficult because, oftentimes the PI also has a strong incentive to want to do the study. You might be very interested in the drug. It might be just the right, drug for a patient population that you see, frequently at your institution. You may want to do the study because you think it's going to result in a good publication in your professional advancement. This all gets back to some of the issues that Patty brought up yesterday about conflicts of interest. They're not always financial conflicts of interest. Sometimes it's sort of professional advancement conflicts of interest. You get that good phase 2 publication out there. Maybe it leads to a phase 3 trial, and you can, lead that study and so on. But the most important thing that we have to do is to be sure that the study is well conducted and well reported. I think none of us have anything more at stake than our professional integrity in doing these studies and in protecting the patients who volunteer to participate in them. And sometimes, if you can't reach agreement with a company in how a study should be designed or conducted, it's better to just walk away.
I have one question is that, the now and more so-called international randomized phase 3 study, and this is a multi-center. Actually, in Eastern country, no matter in Japan and China, we also have so-called the bridging study. Pharmaceutical company try to use the data in China as a registration trials. Mm-hmm. So they usually have the PI in this country. I mean that for this kind of the PI had the right to publish the results of their countries, but should it agree with the global PI or not?
Yeah, so a great question. This happens oftentimes in many multi-center studies where, someone wants to publish a subset of the study results that pertain either to their institution or to their region of the world. And again, I think that is an agreement that should be reached up front before the study is begun. Personally, I think that's generally okay to do that, but not until the overall study results are published. You can't publish any subset from the study until the entire study has been analyzed and published. Once that has occurred, then I think it's all right, to try to publish the subset. Sometimes, the subsets, of course, are oftentimes underpowered or not representative of the overall population, so you may not actually observe the same results in a subset analysis, but as long as the overall study has already been published, then it's okay to do the additional analysis.
So, the question? So I have another questions. As the PI, about the PI, the responsibility. So in the phase 1 trial or the phase 2 trials, in most constituents, we don't know the efficacy. We only know the toxicity. So how to communicate with the patient and how to guarantee the patient's the right?
Yeah. Well, it's really an issue of how you provide the informed consent to the patient. And as Patty was saying yesterday, it's all about transparency. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have to tell the patient what you know, what you don't know, what the potential risks are, the benefits, and the alternatives so that the patient can make the best informed judgment. And you have to tell them if you get new information. As I'll talk about in a moment in the next talk, one of the most difficult things in some phase 2 studies is that, as you are observing the outcomes of the patients on the study, if you're not seeing any anti-tumor activity, at what point does it become difficult to continue to enroll patients on the study? You may not have met the protocol-specified endpoints or the protocol-specified accrual for the study, but, if you haven't seen any anti-tumor activity in your first 10 patients, can you really feel comfortable going to patient number 11 and trying to enroll them on that same protocol, which maybe would require 14 or 20 patients before the formal analysis is done. So again, I think all you can do in those circumstances is to be explicit with the patient, tell them what you know, and then let them use that information to help make a decision.
So, any question? Yeah, please.
May I make an announcement?
Yeah.
Thank you. Those of you who had the pleasure, as I did yesterday, to attend the visit to Guangdong General Hospital, the Guangdong Academy of Medicine, saw an outstanding institution treating enormous numbers of patients in the very most optimal and modern way. We also had the benefit of having our co-chairman, Professor Wu, and his staff lead this this tour. And when I had the pleasure of making a few comments, I addressed Professor Wu, as I often do, as the padrino. And I define padrino as my understanding of it from the Italian, which means godfather. So he is the padrino, the godfather. We have just had join us this morning, and it is a great, great honor for me, and I know it will be a great honor for you, to have amongst us as a guest member of our faculty for the first time, and we hope for every time, that person who I would identify now as Il Presidente, because Professor Francesco Pignati is responsible in Europe and throughout Europe at the European Medicines Agency, EMA, for the registration of all oncology, hematology products and devices. You've heard from Professor Schilsky the responsibilities of a principal investigator of a clinical trial. And he's given us an absolutely encyclopedic, illuminating explanation of what it is and the awesome responsibilities, but also the tremendous opportunities of being a PI, as many of you are and will become. Think for just a moment the responsibilities of Professor Pignati, and realize that it is through him and his agency that ultimately you, with your patients, are going to finally benefit. It is truly a great honor for me, for you, for Cisco, and I would submit for China, to welcome Francesco Pignati. Please stand. And Francesco, I hope you'll allow us during the next day and a half, as is appropriate and as you are comfortable, to make comments from the perspective of you and your responsibilities as the EMA, but also you may, as you wish and choose, make comments as Dr. Pignati. Mille grazie, il Presidente.
And I would point out that Dr. Pignati's job is made a lot easier if you all do your jobs well as being a principal investigator.
Here.
So, shall we go on?
So next speaker, next presentation. So also by the Schilsky,